Hi everyone, and thank you for joining me on Gaffer Gear. In today's episode, we're going to take a look at this very compact light from iFootage. This is the SL1 400 BNS. So this is 400 watts of bicolor light. The controller has a built-in power supply. Now this light has a 1000 increment dimmer, and it has a CCT range from 2700 Kelvin all the way up to 6500 Kelvin. Now the point of difference between this and other lights is it has a very rich color spectrum. Regardless of the CCT you dial in, you get very good color render results. It also has phone app control, DMX control, and the run-of-the-mill special effects. Let's start off with the regular disclaimers. iFootage are not paying me any money for this episode, but they did send me the light for free, and I do get to keep it or sell it at the end of the review. So technically that's a paid endorsement, which is why you get the warning at the start of the episode. All right, so let's jump straight into the pros and cons, starting off with the cons or negatives first. Now these cons aren't necessarily cons for everybody. It's just my point of view as a professional lighting guy. All right, so the big negative for me with this light is it doesn't have any green or magenta color correction, and that is starting to become something that I expect from a bicolor light, particularly in COB. Now, where this is a particular issue for me is at 3200 Kelvin, where the light is noticeably magenta. Now, you can see this in the DMX testing when it's up against a sky panel at 3200 Kelvin. Now, just to get a bit nerdy here, the sky panel came in at minus 0.003 delta UV. So it's very close to the Planckian curve, and the iFootage comes in at minus 0.0033. The next possible negative for some people is there's no battery mount on the controller, so you can't just slap a V-mount battery on this and go outside straight away. You're going to need to use a power station or something like that. The next possible negative is the yoke. So the rest of the light is quite well built. The lock-off here could easily hold in place a large modifier like, say, a 5-foot octo, but there is a little bit of flex in the yoke. So I think the biggest modifier you'd want to put on this is something like a 3-foot dome. The next negative for me is the DMX is a bit shonky. We'll talk about that in the DMX section. And the final negative for me, the light has no CRMX control, which means you can't run it wirelessly off a professional control desk unless you put a receiver in place. Let's get into the pros now, and the biggest overwhelming pro for this light is the spectrum distribution and color render. Regardless of the CCT you dial in, you get quite a rich color spectrum. Most noticeably is the additional color information at 470 nanometers. On most lights, there's a huge dip in this section. Now, is that additional bit of information going to magically make all of your color render look better? No, just stuff that's in that color spectrum. And guess what? That is the color of my garage door. So you can actually see it in the DMX testing when it's up against the sky panel. The next possible pro for people is 1000 increment dimming. So you can get some real fine control over your levels. And the next pro is a little bit odd, power factor unity. This light has a very good transformer with very good power factor unity scores. So if you're somebody who's looking to run lights off battery power stations, you need lights with high power factor unity scores, and this is amongst the best I've come across. With the exception of the yoke, the next big pro for me is the build quality. Everything is stylishly constructed, and even though the light looks like it's made of plastic, it's actually made of metal. The next possible pro is the light is completely flicker free, regardless of the shutter angle you dial in or the frame rate the camera is working at. And the last pro for me, I think this has got the quietest cooling fans that I've never heard. Even the CIA wouldn't be able to listen to these. Okay, let's go through price and what you get, and I do have a bit of a struggle with this section. I can't find a recommended retail price for this online. Everywhere I go, it's on sale or on special. So up until the end of September, a lot of places are selling it for about $700 US or $699 US. The only Australian price I can find is also a sales price, $1,177. So for that price, it's quite good value, but I don't know how much it's going to cost in a couple of months' time. All right, so the light comes in this bag, and the bag is quite well constructed. Everything is very well looked after. All the compartments for your individual items are custom cut with custom cut padded tops. Now, I'm 99% certain this comes with an instruction manual. but I think I've lost it. I can't find it anywhere, but I'm pretty sure I remember reading one. All right, so let's pull out the light and take a look at that. Now, one thing I haven't mentioned so far is the light does not have an IP rating, so ideally you don't want to use it out in the rain. Now, I've already mentioned that the light does look like it's made of plastic, but it is made of metal. And you've got some additional rigging points here on the side that you could use for clamps and things like that. Next is the power supply and controller, which is all built into one. So this has a very good power supply in it. I think I've already mentioned that. Now you've got a micro USB port here. So if you want to use DMX, you have to buy an adapter cable. Next thing in the kit is the supplied reflector, which is a faceted dish. So that gives you maximum output. And of course you also get your power cables. So you get your regional power cable, which has a Nutrix connector. And you get your head lead connector, which is a 5-pin XLR, and this is only 3 meters long. Let's take a look through the menu system. You can adjust your fan settings, which you're never going to do because this thing is super quiet. You can adjust your dimmer curves. You can set your DMX settings. You can select a studio mode. That means the light turns on as soon as it receives power. You can select your language, and you can restore your settings. Now, in terms of firmware updating, that's done over the phone app. Okay, let's have a look at how the light performs with no modifier attached. And as you would expect, it's got a wide, even beam that could easily light a large area or fill a large modifier. The results are the same regardless of the CCT that you dial in. And shadows are very sharp. And this will give you some idea of just how wide or even a spread this can deliver. Now let's take a look with the supplied reflector. And you gain almost 3 times the amount of light. There's no obvious hotspots, and the distribution is what I would expect from a faceted dish. The results are the same regardless of the CCT that you dial in. And it has your typical double shadowing. Now let's use it in a larger area so you get some idea of the capabilities of the dish. And let's take a look from across the road. Now let's take a look with a popular third-party Fresnel. And this is the Nanlite FL20G. The beam does feel a little bit tighter than when it's used on a Nanlite product, but it's not too bad. The results are the same regardless of CCT dialed in. The barn door cuts are a little bit softer than what I would expect, but they're not bad. But wow, you get a lot of firepower out of the spot. And you get reasonable shadows in flood. Okay, so let's talk about the DMX. So before you can use the DMX, you need to get one of these adapter cables that goes from a mini 3-pin to your XLRs. All right, so just a couple of notes with the DMX. If you're doing fade up and fade downs from black, when you're fading down, it'll fall over at the last little bit. And when you're doing a fade up, it'll pop and then do a beautiful fade up. Now, if you need to do an instant blackout, some of the time the daylight emitters will turn off momentarily before the warm white emitters. Now, in terms of, say, doing transitions, if you're just going up in brightness level or down in brightness level, but not to black, or if you're doing a CCT sweep, this does it very smoothly. It's actually quite beautiful. But here's my negatives with the DMX. It's got 2 DMX profiles. The first profile I couldn't even get to work, and the second profile has a bit of a logic problem when it comes to setting a DMX address. Okay, so let's take a look at the problems I've found. So I've got this set to DMX address number 1, and I've got it in DMX mode number 1. Now I've got my XLux here just set up in slider mode. This is address number 1, so let's slide that up. Nothing happens. Nothing happens if I go to address 2, address 3. I can assign everything up high. Nothing happens at all. Okay, now let's take a look at DMX mode number 2. And I've got it set to DMX start address number 1. Okay, so let's slide up channel number 1 and it responds. Channel number 2 switches between your effects mode and CCT mode. Channel number 3 selects your CCT if you're in the CCT mode, so that works perfectly fine. However, watch what happens if I change the DMX address. So let's set the DMX address now to channel number 2. Now channel 2 does not respond, but instead channel number 8 responds. So what I'm guessing is going on here is these guys think that because this is a 7-channel profile, that the next start address would have to be at channel 8 on your DMX controller. So I've done a bit more testing and I've confirmed that theory. So if you set address 3, that's address 15 on your controller. So it's really quite simple. Whatever your address number is, times that by 7 and then subtract 6. Okay, now I've figured out how to get this to work off DMX. Let's start the DMX testing. The anglerfish is set to profile 2, running off DMX address 1, which is actually DMX address 1. It is receiving its commands via an external CRMX receiver. To give you something to compare the response times to, I have a SkyPanel S60C, which is also receiving its commands via an identical external CRMX receiver. Both lights are receiving their commands at the same time. Let's start off with instant cues to black. Now let's do some half-second cues. Now for some 1-second cues. Now for some 2.5-second cues. And now for some 5-second cues. Now let's have a look at some changeovers between 5600 Kelvin and 3200 Kelvin, starting with instant changeovers. Now let's have a look at some half-second cues. Now for some 1-second cues. Now for some 2.5-second cues. And now for some 5-second cues. Now let's have a look at all the test results, starting off with the AC power draw. The maximum power draw recorded over several days of testing was 408 watt. At 3200 Kelvin, I measure 364 watt, and at 5600, I measure 376 watt. If you're looking to run this light off a battery inverter system or a small generator, the power factor unity scores are quite impressive, so it shouldn't be a problem at all. Now let's take a look at the dimming characteristics. And according to my frequency meter, this light is not running pulse width modulation, so it should be completely flicker free regardless of the frame rate or shutter speed that the camera is set to. Now let's take a look at the dimming characteristics at 3200 Kelvin, and I've taken readings at 100%, 75%, 50%, 25%, 10%, 5%, 1% and 0.1%. Now just to note here, 0.1% isn't a true 0.1%. It's probably closer to 2 or 3%. The CCT is incredibly consistent. The TM30 color render scores do decrease from 96 down to 94. And even though at 3200 Kelvin the light is more magenta than I'd like it to be, it is incredibly consistent right across its dimming range. This is quite amazing for a light that is not pulse width modulation. Now let's take a look at 5600 Kelvin. Once again, the CCT is incredibly consistent. The light does drop from a TM30 color render score of 98 down to 95 as it dims, and at 5600 Kelvin the light does shift towards green as you dim it, but the shift is well under that of the equivalent of a 1/8 correction gel, so I don't think it would be noticeable. Now let's take a look at our average CCT accuracies. And I've broken this up into different sections in the normal, just so the averages are not misleading. Between 2700 to 3400 Kelvin, it reads over the CCT target value. From 3500 Kelvin down to 5200 Kelvin, it reads under the dialed in target value. From 5250 to 6000 Kelvin, it reads over the target value by an average of plus 43. And from 6050 Kelvin to 6500 Kelvin, it does drift under and above the target value by an average CCT of 24. Now let's take a look at the color render score measured in TM30 RF. Between 2700 to 3600 Kelvin, it scores 96. From 3650 Kelvin to 4500 Kelvin, it scores a 97. And from 4550 Kelvin onwards, it has its highest score of 98. Now let's take a closer look at the Kelvins, starting off with the lowest CCT that we can dial in. Now with this light, some of its biggest pros are in this section. But the devil is in the detail, so are some of the negatives. When I dialed in 2700 Kelvin, I got 2751. The TM30 color testing results were 96% average color accuracy with an average 100% color saturation. With the CRI scores, all of them are plus 90. The spectrum distribution is very good. And the white point came in with 0 delta UV, which places it right on the Planking curve. Now this isn't necessarily a good thing because that means it's going to be off target at 3200 Kelvin because it is a bicolor light with no green magenta correction. When I dialed in 3200 Kelvin, I got 3222 with an SSI score of 90. The TM30 color testing results were 96% average color accuracy with an average 102% color saturation. With the CRI scores, only R12 is below 90. The spectrum distribution is very healthy. And the white point came in with a delta UV of minus 0.0032, which means the light at this point would be slightly magenta to close to the equivalent of a 1/8 correction gel. When I dialed in 4400 Kelvin, I got 4401. The TM30 color testing results were 97% average color accuracy with an average 102% color saturation. With the CRI scores, only R9 was below 90. The spectrum distribution is very impressive. And the white point came in with a delta UV of minus 0.0030, which would give the light at this point a slight magenta hue to roughly about the equivalent of a 1/8 correction gel. When I dialed in 5600 Kelvin, I got 5653 with an SSI score of 84. The TM30 color testing results were 98% average color accuracy with an average 101% color saturation. With the CRI scores, all of them are plus 95. The spectrum distribution is impressive. And the white point came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0008. So if you're working to the Planking curve, this is very close to perfect, but if you're working to the daylight curve, the light will have a slight magenta hue to close to, but not quite, the equivalent of a 1/8 correction gel. When I dialed in the maximum 6500 Kelvin, I got 6488. The TM30 color testing results were 98% average color accuracy with an average 100% color saturation. All of the CRI scores are plus 90. The spectrum distribution is still very impressive, and the white point came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0041. That's another review done. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to click like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next episode. Take care.